Ms. Larigauderie, IPBES is one of the global leading initiatives in the realm of biodiversity in connecting scientific information to policymakers. Just like I think the IPCC is doing and its reports are triggering climate action, IPBES is aiming to support ambitious international action on nature and on biodiversity with its scientific findings. How can the science put forward by IPBES help and ensure that nature and biodiversity are or will be firmly embedded into the climate emergency planning and commitments and actions? Please, Madam.
Thank you very much, Gino, and good afternoon and morning. Greetings to all of the participants. And so what IPBES does is to provide options for action that is drawn from its scientific assessment. As you pointed out, IPBES produces scientific assessment like IPCC. And so the IPBES Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which came out last year, has showed that biodiversity is a key to reaching several major development goals, including hunger, good health, clean water, and climate. And therefore that protecting biodiversity, protecting nature brings a solution to many development issues. And the global assessment also showed that cities have a major role to play, and that they should place biodiversity at the center of their plans. And this is really starting to happen. I'd like to give concrete examples of how cities can get involved on biodiversity by following three directions, if you will. So the first one is that cities can make space for biodiversity, which serves, of course, for biodiversity itself, for nature, but also to provide other nature-based solutions. So, for example, cities can enhance green space, make parks, ponds, green roofs, and that will promote not only biodiversity in the city, but also the health and well-being of its inhabitants. It will also help mitigate against climate change by reducing the heat island effects of cities. It will reduce air pollution. Cities can also protect the watersheds around their city limits, which will have an impact on the quality and the quantity of their water. And city can also promote urban gardens, which can have an impact on biodiversity by, for example, promoting pollinators. But there also it is win-win because it can also improve the food, the health and the diet of its inhabitants. So that's about making space for nature in cities. Now, the second way for cities to act on biodiversity is to reduce, of course, their impact on biodiversity. And cities can do that by controlling their own spread, what we call urban sprawl. And urban sprawl at the global level has doubled since 1992 in terms of the total area occupied by cities. So to protect the biodiversity, we need to give some of this space back to other forms of life. And so we need to try and densify cities and to develop low impact transportation systems in order to do that. We need to design also roads that do not hurt nature, but that can promote it, for example, by not cutting through natural habitats or by promoting pollinators on roadsides. There are many ways to bring back biodiversity on infrastructures like roads. And finally, in terms of reducing impacts, cities can also safeguard their urban biodiversity areas, and also ensure connectivity between them. And then finally, and very quickly for that third point, cities can improve access to urban services, particularly for low-income communities. So access to clean water, to transportation that allows to reduce certain forms of pollution, and also to reduce the use of fossil fuels, and also to improve access to green spaces so that everyone can benefit from nature. So there are, as you can see, many different ways that cities can act on biodiversity. And in fact, we are really starting to see cities coming up with their plan for biodiversity like they've been doing for climate change. And that is really very encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madame Larigauderie, for your response. I'd like to turn to Mayor Helps, and having listened to Madame Larigauderie, I would be interested to hear from you, Mayor Helps, as an urban leader. How do you, in practical terms, address the climate and biodiversity emergency demands in your city? And surely, I would think that it requires you to take a new way of thinking and planning. So in that sense, what type of new data, information, or guidance do you expect, or would you need also from the scientific community, so that your work at the local level can be more effectively implemented and communicated? Mayor Helps?
Great, thank you. Good morning. It was very inspiring to hear Anne's remarks, and I could spend a lot of time talking about biodiversity and some of the things we're doing here in the city. If there's time at the end, maybe I'll do that. But I do want to answer the question about data, because it's really important. It's not a very easy thing, particularly in an increasingly polarizing world, to be a daring city leader. And part of the reason that it's challenging is because as city leaders right now, we need to look ahead 50 years or 100 years, when most of our residents and our businesses are just focused on their day-to-day life. So it's a difficult tension for us, because we need to look around every day and make sure that our residents have their needs met now, but we always have to be looking into the future and understand that some of the decisions that we're making now might not be understood for decades to come. And really the right kind of data and information, the things that Anne and also the IPCC are producing, are really important to help us tell our residents stories about why we're making the decisions we're making. So in March 2018, and I think you were there as well, we were part of an exciting meeting in Edmonton, Alberta, where a number of local leaders from around the world met for the weekend in advance of the IPCC meeting. And we spent the weekend in deliberations on the importance of data and information to drive forward our ambitious agenda as cities. And at the end of the weekend, we released a declaration called the Edmonton Declaration. And I just want to highlight the key piece, because it's more important than ever. So we called on the IPCC to work collaboratively with cities and city organizations to assess knowledge gaps pertinent to cities and climate change, improve current knowledge and data gaps, and make available better analysis of local climate data in order to deliver solutions impacting climate change policies and decisions, particularly within our city boundaries. So that was our main call to IPCC, and it's really great to see some of that work being taken up. Yet, 2 years later, cities continue to face major challenges in measuring our greenhouse gas emissions. And this is really important. The greenhouse gas emissions caused not only within our boundaries by buildings, transportation, and waste, and so on, but also, and importantly, the emissions that are generated by the goods and services that we're consuming in cities, but we're producing outside of cities. So it's all well and good, for example, to preserve biodiversity in our own cities, to build more urban parks. But if we're harvesting the global rainforest to build new homes, that needs to be accounted for as well. So these consumption-based or embodied emissions, they're really important for cities to track, because knowing more about the actual impacts of city living can help us to change our policies and behaviors to better reflect that we're part of a global network of flows of energy, goods, and services. So, and you know, I'll wrap up quickly, but I just want to share that it's data that's really important for policymaking, but it's making that data alive and real in our communities that's helpful to our citizens. So, you know, what if, and this is just a big, bold idea, what if, you know, in every city around the world, most of us have cell phones, that every time we went above as a community, the emissions target we'd set, we'd all get an alert on our cell phone saying, okay, we're not doing very well today, like making it alive like that. So there's the data that for policy making, but then there's the data for storytelling. And again, having the data helps us to make the case to our residents and businesses. It will allow us to do more articulate and more compelling storytelling. So for example, we can say, here's the data, and that's why we're removing lanes for cars and returning them to people on foot or with bicycles. Here's the data, and this is why we're using property taxes to fund free transit for youth. Or here's the data, and this is how we're going to prioritize removing oil tanks. Or here's the data, and this is why we're bringing in stricter guidance for new buildings. So the data is important for policymaking, but the data is also important for storytelling. So for city leaders, we need that data, and really happy to have this opportunity to share more about how and why. Thanks, Gino.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Madame Larigauderie, as we all know, over the next year, 2021, the global community is expected to agree on a deal for nature, and new climate plans need to be developed. So in that international context, how do you think IPBES can support action on nature and biodiversity, in particular at a local level, and in doing so, contribute to those international negotiations?
So linking climate to biodiversity is absolutely key. And so it's very important that we're discussing this aspect today. So IPBES can make two types of contributions. The first one, of course, is to provide, again, scientific information on these tight connections between biodiversity and climate change. So there is already quite a body of scientific literature that has been assessed, which shows several types of linkages between biodiversity and climate change. So the first one is that there is an increasing documentation on how climate change is affecting biodiversity. We see that there are species shifts towards the poles, towards the higher altitudes, for example, new ecosystems made of new species with new emerging properties, and also local extinctions for those species that cannot move to a more favorable climate situations. So climate change has an impact on biodiversity. Then another type of linkage that has also been showed is that forests and other types of ecosystems, but particularly forests, can provide options to mitigate against climate change by withdrawing carbon from the atmosphere. And therefore, biodiversity and nature can be part of the solution to climate change. Again, the nature-based solution. And a third aspect, there are others, but that I would like to underline, is, and perhaps the most important one, is the implications of the large-scale deployment of fossil fuels for biodiversity, for the need in terms of land that implies, and the threats that could represent with natural habitats, since, as you know, there is limited amount of so-called marginal lands to deploy bioenergy around the world, and so that would most certainly come at the expense of biodiversity and perhaps also food security. So that is why biodiversity and climate change really needs to be tightly coupled. And another area that IPBES is moving into on that same topic is to do its share in terms of engaging with the scientific community. So you may have heard that in December, we're going to have a co-sponsored workshop, as we call it, with IPCC. So it's symbolic, it's the first time. I'm sure that there will be other forms of contribution, and that will lead next year to a IPBES and IPCC workshop report that would then look in depth at these connections and inform both COP15 and also COP26. And the Climate Change Convention in particular really needs to be more aware of biodiversity and hear more about these connections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madame Larigauderie. Mayor Helps, I know that you just said in your intervention that science is more important now than ever, in particular in a world of increasing polarization. Now, many urban petitioners, as you also explained, are suffering from a lack of local data that may be available at higher levels, but are not necessarily exchanged with yourselves. So what role do you think you as local government, regional governments can play in order to narrow this gap?
That's a great question. I think that one of the things that local governments are really good at is convening and bringing people together and using our soft power. Local governments in Canada don't have very much actual authority, but we have that convening power. So one of the things that I think we need to do better is to build relationships with the state and federal governments, and through these relationships to set up formal data sharing protocols so that information can flow both ways. So for example, local governments that are leading on climate action, we're tracking the emissions as we implement new programs. So for example, we know that the relative quantity of emissions reductions achieved through retrofitting of public and private buildings. We're doing a retrofit here at City Hall. We know how many emissions will be reduced. We know the emissions reductions from sustainable transportation. So right now in Victoria, we're building a bike network. And when the network is done, we know that will reduce emissions by about 10,000 tons per year. We've banned plastic bags. We know that that's going to keep 1 million bags a year out of the landfill. So we have that local data, but there's no formal reporting up mechanism. So for us to say, here's the changes that we're making and here's the impacts that it's having. So I think having a formal reporting up mechanism for local governments to show the actions that we're taking and the impacts that they're having, and then also a formal reporting down mechanism, so the data and information that's gathered at a more aggregate level, for example, regional transportation data, can be shared with cities. So I think cities have a real role to play in setting up that data sharing relationship. I think it's also good for national and state governments that the action that we're taking in cities is actually helping them to deliver on some of the ambitious plans and targets that they've set. But again, they don't even know yet some of the impacts that we're having. So I think that us reporting up to state and federal governments can help them say, oh, look, that city over there and that city over there and that city over there, they're helping us achieve our targets. And it also is good because they're also often investing money in these programs, and they're not asking us to show how we're quantifying the climate action results. So that's I think really important. Equally important, and this is why ICLEI is so brilliant, if we had these formal data sharing protocols, in our own countries, within our own cities, then cities would also learn from each other. No one would need to know that if you build this many kilometers of bike network, it's going to reduce emissions by this much, that is done. So although we can't do this without state and federal support, I think we can take the lead to request these formal data sharing mechanisms be set up. And as I said, it's also good for state and national governments because they often fund some of these initiatives and they can then show progress for some of the money that they're spending. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully we can do some work on this because it's really important work.
Thank you very much, Mayor Helps, and thank you, Madame Larigauderie, Executive Secretary of IPBES, for your insights and assessments. Knowing more is a prerequisite for local and regional governments to actually act better. We will be discussing the issue of knowing more in the next 3 weeks far more in detail.